Are you an early career psychologist who wants to start running best practice evidence-based autism assessments? This video gives you 3 easy steps to start running your first adult autism assessment in no time. Step 1 to a best practice adult autism assessment is questionnaires. And there are 3 specific types of questionnaires that you want to include in your assessment. First of all, you want to have an autism-specific self-report questionnaire. So this is a questionnaire that asks specifically about autism-related behaviors and cognitions, and that is completed by the client who is sitting in front of you. Then you also want to have another completed autism-specific questionnaire. So this is again a questionnaire that specifically looks at those autism-related behaviors and cognitions, but this one is filled out by a significant other in the client's life, so a partner or a parent or a close friend, because you really want to get those multiple perspectives on the person's behavior and cognitions. Often what you will see with autism is that there will be some discrepancies between the self-report and the other report questionnaires, and that's completely okay. Doesn't mean that either of those reports is incorrect or wrong. It simply tells us that both people have a different perspective on the client's behaviors and cognitions. And often what we see with autism is that other people, other significant people in the client's life might feel more strongly that the client's behavior falls outside the norm than the client feels this themselves. Examples of autism-specific questionnaires that you could administer, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just an example, are questionnaires like the SRS, the Social Responsiveness Scale, or the AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient. One other thing that you also might want to consider including in the questionnaire part of your autism assessment for adults is a broad screening questionnaire that covers a whole range of difficulties and strengths that people might display. So this is really important, especially in the later stages, but also in the early stages of the assessment, when you're thinking about what could be alternative explanations for the client's strengths and limitations, right? So you can imagine that clients might show quite similar behaviors, at least some similar behaviors, if they fall on the autism spectrum, and also if they have very strong social anxiety, right? So this broad screening questionnaire will help you look at things like, is there an alternative explanation for the client's behaviors and cognitions? It will also help you look at, are there any additional diagnoses that I should look at making? For example, does the client fall on the autism spectrum but also show signs of depression or show signs of anxiety? Step 2 to a best practice evidence-based autism assessment is observation and interview. So it's important that you bring some structure to the interview and the observations that you carry out, just so that it's evidence-based and kind of standardized from one person to another, what you look at. So there's several standardized interview and observation instruments that are out there that you can use. One very well-known one is the ADOS, and another one that's more up and coming is the MIGDAS. So in the ADOS for adults, you observe their behavior throughout certain tasks. So you, for example, ask them to execute a task without speaking and kind of show you how to do a daily self-care task like brushing hair or brushing teeth. You also ask them to tell you a story, make up a story with some random objects, and there are many other different tasks that you go through in the ADOS. There are also questions within the ADOS that ask about social skills, friendships, ambitions, future plans, etc. The ADOS is not necessarily the most neurodiversity affirming instrument, because of different reasons. One reason is that the tasks are meant to be accessible to a very wide audience. So they are a bit limited, and they can feel a bit awkward to clients to participate in. Um, a more neurodiversity affirming alternative is the MIGDAS. So the MIGDAS is mainly interview question based, but what you do while you go through the interview with the client in front of you, and often also with a significant other present, you also observe the behaviors of the client in front of you. So one thing is, for example, you always put fidget tools on the table that's in the room in front of you, and you kind of observe whether the client interacts with these. Do they get fixated on one particular object? Do they manipulate it in certain ways, etc.? You also look at their eye contact, at their gestures, at their facial expressions. So you rate all those things as well. But both the ADOS and the MIGDAS are very structured. So you work your way through a structured observation and question based interview. A third step to best practice evidence based autism assessment is the evaluation of cognition. So this does not always necessarily have to take the shape of conducting a cognitive assessment, but that's one option, right? So as part of your autism assessment, you might want to conduct a cognitive assessment. Usually I choose this option when I have suspicions based on previous evidence or based on interactions with the client that they might score quite low cognitively. So there might be a cognitive impairment. That's something that you indicate when you diagnose autism as well, whether it's with or without intellectual disability. It is not the only reason why I might do a cognitive assessment. I might also do a cognitive assessment on the other end of the spectrum. So if I have an indication that a client might score particularly high cognitively, I would often do a cognitive assessment as well. Part of the reason for doing that is that it's interesting information for the client to have, so it gives them a more complete picture of their neurodiversity. Um, but it can also often be informative in terms of coping and compensatory mechanisms. So often what we see with people who are highly intelligent but also fall on the autism spectrum is that they're often quite capable of learning the rules of social situations, for example. And so when they're interacting with others, it's not always that obvious that they might be autistic. However, for themselves, it feels very effortful. It feels very cognitively involved to engage in social interactions, for example. So, having a bit more information about the cognitive baseline of someone can be quite helpful in those instances. If you can't or don't want to or think it's not necessary to do a cognitive assessment like the WAIS or the Stanford Binet, for example, you can also look at the information that the client has provided to you. So they might have provided to you report cards from when they were in primary school, when they were in high school. They might have or have not attended university or post-secondary education schooling, right? So you can use all of those things to um, make a guess about where this person would sit in terms of cognitive ability, right? So someone who has attended university, finished a course in engineering, and did so with quite good grades, it's highly unlikely that this person would fall in the intellectually impaired kind of area of cognitive ability, right? So we can really exclude that if we know this about the background of a person. What we would conclude most likely is that they score above average in terms of cognitive ability. And so it might not necessarily be that needed or that necessary for us to conduct a structured, standardized cognitive assessment. You can also draw on in session information, right? So when you're having conversations with this person without taking into account things like eye contact, etc., but just at the cognitive level. Can this person understand very specific questions that you ask? Can they answer questions, or can they fill out the questionnaires, etc.? So be careful when you do that, that you're not biased by the limitations that people might have due to their autism, right? So make sure that you're truly assessing cognitive ability. Another reason why doing a standardized cognitive assessment might be quite useful and quite informative and often best practice is because it gives you more detailed information about the cognitive profile of an individual, right? So how do they do in terms of working memory? How do they do in terms of visual spatial ability? What about their verbal ability? And are there any interesting discrepancies between those different subscales? If you want to learn more about best practice autism assessment, stay tuned and subscribe to my channel. Also, please like this video if you enjoyed the content. And in the comment section, please let me know what kind of content you would like me to cover in future videos about neurodiversity.